Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a superstar with us tonight from Australia. We have Dr. Jennifer Buckingham, and Jennifer wrote a fantastic blog that you can find on the 5 from 5 website, and the name of it is Don't Discard Comprehension Strategies. And we're going to be talking to her about this article. Let me first tell you a little bit about Dr. Buckingham. She is the Director of Strategy and Senior Research Fellow at MultiLit and Director of the 5 from 5 Project. Jennifer is the founder of the 5 from 5 Project, which provides evidence-based information on effective reading instruction, and her full bio will be in the show notes. So we're going to get started. And Jennifer, I have so many things from your article. I took notes, but I'm going to start off with a quote that you have in the article. And you said, the objective of strategies, the objective of teaching comprehension strategies explicitly is to make them metacognitively transparent and understandable to children so they can apply them in their reading and then go on to use them implicitly. So I'd like to start off by talking about that. Why is it important to try to start off by making this connection early on so then later they can internalize it?
Thank you, Faith. Thanks for that very kind introduction. So it's lovely to be here. Lovely to meet you too, Judy. So the reason I wanted to draw people's attention to this is because reading comprehension, as we know, super complex. The more you read about it, the more you realize how little we really understand about what's going on in the brain when we are comprehending a piece of text. So we know some of that, and where there are a lot of theories and there's a lot of research, a lot of evidence, but there is an enormous amount to understand. And one thing I think that tends to get lost is for reading comprehension, like other skills, there is a beginner to expert or a novice to expert trajectory. So for beginning readers and also for struggling readers, we can't make any assumptions about what they know how to do. And so the analogy that I use is with phonics. So we understand that for some children, they understand the code relatively quickly, and with a bit of explicit instruction in the alphabetic principle and some phonics, they sort of they can make those connections and they start to read and break that code relatively quickly and easily. For other students, you need to be super explicit. You need to take the time to teach them in a really systematic and methodical way. And that is the best way to ensure that all children learn how to decode accurately and with automaticity. And we don't know at the outset which children those are going to be. So we have some idea from screeners, things like phonemic awareness and so on, but it's not a foolproof way of saying, okay, well, you need lots of explicit instruction and you don't. And there'll be some students who need lots to start with, not so much later. Not very much to start with, lots later. We can't know that trajectory in advance. So the best way is to draw on those principles we know about effective instruction, and that is to teach things explicitly. And that way we can be most assured that children are going to grasp them.
So, Judy and I had a few episodes on about comprehension. And, we had people talking about it. And there's a lot of controversy, Jennifer, about using comprehension strategies for how long, how much time do you spend on it? Do we even need to teach comprehension strategies? Because here in this country, a lot of people now are adopting really knowledge-based curriculum. there was a big move to have a core curriculum that is knowledge-based or content area, reading curriculum. There are different types of names for it, but essentially it is all about building knowledge, where some people have said that strategies are not so important. So could you comment on that?
Absolutely. And that was the reason for, really why I wrote that blog post, is I felt there had been an overcorrection. So, which it often happens in reading research and translation of reading research into practice, that there can be a pendulum swing and people overcorrect because there has been, examples of poor practice. And instead of sort of taking a bit of a sophisticated view of that and saying, okay, well, maybe doing a lot of this or doing things this way isn't effective, perhaps we need to think about how we finesse that a bit, calibrate it better to reject things. And I feel like that's what happened with the knowledge versus skills or the knowledge versus strategies debate, is that there was an understanding or a sense that strategies were being emphasized to the expense of knowledge. And instead of sort of bringing that, calibrating that a bit more carefully, there was this rejection of strategies and embracing of the idea that knowledge was everything and you didn't actually need to teach strategies at all. And I think that came from partly that overcorrection tendency, but also perhaps a misunderstanding of the differences between strategies and skills, and those terms to be used interchangeably when they really shouldn't be. There's a difference between those two things.
Yeah, so Judy, as you know, we've talked about this quite a bit in some other episodes. And I think, we also felt pretty strongly, just from our teaching experience, that teaching comprehension strategies are, very important for kids to be able to have this. And as Jennifer said, not all kids are able to just do it. Just because you can read the words doesn't mean you're going to automatically be able to comprehend. So now give us a little bit of an understanding now what's happening in New York City. So there were 3 possible programs that could be chosen in the school districts. And I think all of them had a pretty strong, supposedly, knowledge base to it. Are comprehension strategies part of the core curriculum in all of those programs? And I know you could only speak to what maybe you have in your school district, but could you tell us a little bit about what's happening?
Right. So, we've been hearing a lot about knowledge building curriculum for a while. New York City finally buckled down the law. I think they wanted to do this before COVID, but COVID came along and then things kind of, didn't take place as soon as we had hoped for in New York City. But now that COVID is over, new mayor, new chancellor, and they said, that's it. We're bringing in evidence research-based curriculum. The 3 curriculums that New York City selected were Wit and Wisdom, Expeditionary Learning, and HMH. Now, I know that some may be considered more of knowledge building than others, stronger in that component than others. Some have also been in the field longer than others, so that's also something to monitor and so forth. And I don't know all the pieces of like how long they were tested. I know HMH was only in the field for a little while and so forth. So, things are evolving on a daily basis. But, for me, it was all really strange that people would just assume that, that knowledge building portion would just magically, give kids information that they needed in order to really, dive deep into the text. First of all, not all of our students came to school with an equal amount of background knowledge. Building background knowledge is sometimes really, really, really hard and takes time and so forth. And, you know, we know that building knowledge is critical and immersing deep into topics is very important, but my gut always told me that showing kids strategies and ways to, you know, dive deeper into text is very important as well. And, you know, as I'm going on my structured literacy journey, I'm finding that that is really true. Like I'm right now taking a course that Leslie Lord was kind enough to introduce me to, which is SRSD. And there's this do what strategy. And I'm like, oh my God, it's powerful stuff. When you read a short response question, all you have to do is make this little T-chart of what the question is asking you to do, like maybe explain, and then what are you explaining? And just that simple strategy is so powerful because I'm already using it in the field, and it's like kids are like, wow, we have this knowledge, and here's a way that we could break it down if we see a question and possibly write a more powerful response. So, you know, I can't speak.
I'd like to go with that. I'd like to go
Yeah.
with that. So, Jennifer, so Judy just brought up a strategy that is part of a writing framework. And, you know, we were talking about how important writing and reading go together, and how that some of the strategies you use for writing could be used in reading. What are your thoughts about how we did teach strategies? Were we really doing a good job in schools teaching comprehension strategies? Personally, I think that's why people think that we don't need them, is because we never really did it well in the first place. What are your thoughts?
I think there's a variety of different approaches that were taken. I think that there's a sense that, and I don't think this is necessarily as true in Australia. I don't want to generalize from, you know, what was being done in the States to what's being done here, but there was a lot of kind of repetition of, you know, using just little isolated bits of text, and using, you know, trying to learn to use one particular comprehension strategy or approach, and it might be, you know, finding the main idea, which is the one that people have the most problem with generally, even though, you know, really when you think about it, you know, that's just the same thing as summarizing and, you know, getting the gist. So finding the main ideas got a bit of a bad reputation, but I think that's sort of it's a bit of a misnomer that that's all you're doing when you're so-called finding the main idea. But doing that in a disjointed way for weeks and weeks and weeks on unrelated pieces of text, yeah, you can see how that would, you know, have a very marginal benefit after the first few times. So the first few times you do that, you know, it's not, I don't think that's such a big deal. It's not as though that's going to do any child any harm. It's sort of making that, you know, the concept explicit to them, using a piece of text that, you know, that is what it's been chosen for. So focusing their attention on the thing that you want them to understand or learn how to do, but then very quickly what should have been happening was that being transferred into working with, you know, texts that were part of a larger unit of work, whether it was a knowledge-based unit, whether it's a novel, something that was actually going to be, you know, have some sort of depth of content or literature base that they'd be learning from the text as well as learning with the text. And so I think that was the missing step for a while. And that doesn't mean, though, that we now reject that first step entirely. There is still, you know, a really good evidence base for, you know, particular comprehension strategies to be taught explicitly, but not in that isolated, repetitive way, in an integrated way and with each other, and very quickly then, you know, placed within the context of, you know, some learning material of some kind.
So I would agree with you. Absolutely. You mentioned in the article that it should happen for a limited time and at the right time. Could you explain what the right time means and what is limited time in terms of what we should expect?
Yeah. So the right time, I guess, is for beginning readers is from the beginning of instruction. So for beginning readers, before they can read connected text, we're doing that through oral shared reading. So, you know, they're learning how to decode, you know, that there's sort of these two parallel streams almost that are roughly, you know, aligned with a simple view of reading, the, you know, decoding and language comprehension. And so for beginning readers who aren't actually reading yet, you need to be developing vocabulary and comprehension through text that you're reading to them and with them. Meanwhile, they're learning how to decode and read accurately and fluently, and gradually those two things merge. You know, they're starting to be able to read sentences and passages, and then eventually, you know, longer pieces of text, and they're bringing with them those skills that you've worked with, you know, strategies or skills. I conceptualize strategies eventually becoming skills. So, you know, you teach particular comprehension monitoring is a really good example of that. So teaching that as a strategy to begin with, and after a while, that becomes a skill that kids use implicitly and not necessarily consciously. But then sometimes they still use it strategically. You know, they still have it in their toolbox. You know, they're reading something that's relatively simple and easy to understand, then their comprehension monitoring is going to happen relatively effortlessly. But even, you know, us as skilled readers, we still do use those strategies in a deliberate and strategic way when we're reading something that's a bit more difficult, or we're reading for a purpose that requires us to have a deeper understanding or to be able to demonstrate a deeper understanding of it. So there is kind of a trajectory of skill development. So I started with at the right time. So at the beginning for all readers, because, you know, I said at the outset, because we don't know who's going to be able to pick these things up quickly and who isn't. And for a limited time, in the sense that you know, that making that transition from explicit, you know, without really being too worried about the text that you're using, for a limited time doing that, into, you know, the content. I mean, no one's arguing that knowledge building is a bad thing. You know, I'd like to think that is, you know, something that we can take as a given, that background knowledge is essential for reading comprehension. It's a good in itself, even putting aside reading comprehension as being the outcome variable. It's just a good thing for children to, you know, students to know things. But so in terms of being able to say X number of hours, that's something that research hasn't told us yet. So it may be that, again, to draw the phonics analogy, you know, there's no point in teaching letter sound correspondences, blending and segmenting, once children know it and they demonstrate that they know it. Some students might struggle. You need to teach them for a bit longer through intervention. Some students might, you know, have a little bit of a relapse where they find that difficult. When you get into extended code and the complexity of text increases, you might need to do a little bit more phonic work with them, particularly for spelling. And similarly for strategies, you know, you teach it at the outset, but then you might need to revisit it. You might need to come back to it, you know, as the complexity of text or the type of text that children are working with changes, to kind of activate that again. Say, okay, well, this is the way we've used summarizing or comprehension monitoring or visualizing previously. Here's how we're going to do it now with this particular passage or book that we're working on. But ideally, you wouldn't need to spend as long on it. It would be a sort of reactivating of that strategy and being able to use it in a new and different way.
Jennifer, can I ask you a question? So you mentioned, if I understood correctly, that a strategy could eventually become a skill. Is that correct? Can you talk a little bit about that, a little bit more about that? Because I think that would be really interesting to a lot of the teachers in the field and so forth, on how and when that happens.
Yeah, I guess we know when that happens, you know, through seeing it demonstrated by questioning, you know, whether it's oral questioning or answering questions. And you brought up the issue of writing earlier, and it's real, as the further children, you know, progress through schooling, the harder it is to separate writing from reading and reading comprehension, because that's largely how we ask students to demonstrate their comprehension, is through the way that they express it in writing. So that strategy to skill kind of progression, it will depend a little bit on the complexity of the text, but there are some skill or some strategies that will become implicit skills. Think something like comprehension monitoring, you know, that's something that you'll just start to do. There are other strategies that might continue to, well, generally will continue to be used in a deliberate and conscious way. So skills are something we tend to use automatically without necessarily consciously doing it or without a great deal of effort. A strategy is something that you're using more deliberately for a particular purpose, and you've decided to do it. And to decide to do it, you need to know how to do it in the first place. So it still needs to, you know, there's that teaching element, but some of those things are on a kind of continuum developmental trajectory. Other things are, you know, things that you will need to do that generally are always an active thing rather than a passive thing. So one of those things is summarizing. You know, it's unless you have made a decision that you're going to summarize something after you've read it, you don't usually tend to sort of stop after a paragraph or a page and do a little mental summary or write one down. That's something that, you know, it's a strategy for a purpose. So that would sit in that deliberate, active strategy basket. But then there are other sort of comprehension skills that you just sort of do, you know, whatever it is that you're reading.
So Jennifer, yeah, that was a good question, Judy. And I think clarifying the difference was an important point. So
you know why, Faith? Because since the beginning of time, since I started teaching, there's always at every PD, what's a skill, what's a strategy, labeling them, deciding which one is a skill, which one is a strategy. Then people mess up and they label it in the wrong category and then they're confused. So I think it was definitely
I see
something.
Jennifer shaking her head.
Yeah, if you could choose, I did a little exercise in this a few months ago. I pulled out, you know, 4 pieces of writing where people were writing, you know, talking about comprehension strategies and skills, and they all categorize them differently. So because reading comprehension is so integrated and it's, you know, it's multi-component, you know, we know it's not a single construct. It's multiple constructs. They all affect each other. It's really difficult to create these 2 separate baskets and say one as the other. I think it's more useful to think about whether it's something that you're doing actively or passively, and whether it's something that you can then call on to use in a strategic way, even if it's become an implicit skill.
Now, let me ask you another question.
Wait, just let me.
Oh, yes, sorry.
So I'm going to jump right in here, and I just want to know if this is BS or not BS. You know, we use the BS button.
To be or not to be.
So we want to know if this is BS. You put in here, comprehension instruction must always be embedded in a knowledge building curriculum. BS? Is that what you're saying? That is BS?
I think it's the always, you know, that I would question. I think it should eventually be, and, you know, as quickly as possible, it should be embedded in a content building curriculum, but it doesn't have to be, you know, from the start. I think we need to sort of bring in, well, look at the evidence. The evidence shows that their comprehension strategy intervention has high effect sizes. And yes, we say, okay, yes, there's a background knowledge piece that's really important as well, but there's an explicit element of those interventions that isn't necessarily part of a knowledge building curriculum. But again, you wouldn't want to do that forever. The other part of it is that I think most of the studies that show the benefits of having the comprehension instruction and content embedded or integrated are with older students. So from year 3 upwards. There is at the moment relatively limited evidence about how you do that, especially there's a great, you know, we sort of, I think it's accepted it's a really good idea to try and do that somehow from the beginning of school, from K to 2. At the moment, when, you know, that there's not really strong evidence about the best way to do that. So in that blog, I just wanted to reassure teachers they don't have to panic, especially if they're working with beginning readers, that they're not, integrating that in a really kind of sophisticated way. Because at the moment, the evidence still says it's okay to teach comprehension strategies, build knowledge at the same time or alongside. Over time, we will, be more evidence about that. Lots of great people working on this question. But at the moment, it's still okay to do both. You don't necessarily have to panic about doing them at the same time.
So Judy, this is very interesting to me because I think this is how we always felt. Just from our experience, both Judy and I have been classroom teachers and literacy coaches. And, I was part of Reading First, Jennifer, and I was a regional literacy coach. And from my understanding—
Nurse, you've been in those classrooms?
Well, between classroom teaching and classroom coaching and being an administrator, 37 years.
And 26 for me. And it's funny how the whole world, Faith and Judy said something, and the whole world is like—
Yeah, we were pretty much attacked about that. And from my understanding and from what I've read, comprehension strategies are important, and K-2, grades K1 and 2 in particular, while kids are learning how to decode, we are building those strategies through read alouds and talking and trying to develop all the thinking that goes into it. And once they're able to read for themselves, then we are weaving that in. And I didn't think we had to start with a knowledge-based curriculum in kindergarten, although building background knowledge is important. And I think that's what's misunderstood, Jennifer, at least from what I'm seeing from a lot of people out there. And I think that's why you wrote the article, because it's like this overcorrection that's going on. So you don't have to call BS, but I think it is a BS moment when people are saying, boom, yeah, it was BS. So that
I have so many questions too, Faith. I wasn't feeling good today, but all of a sudden meeting Jennifer got me a little excited because this is a very interesting discussion. Jennifer, so let me ask you something. So I'm in the classrooms all the time. Obviously, some programs are better at knowledge building and so forth. So that's a whole nother topic. But in the early grades, right? A lot of kids, K1, 2, especially K1, the kids are just learning how to read, right? So what is the main, and they have, a phonics block before that where they're learning how to decode and so forth. What is the main purpose of like the general quote unquote, what we call the ELA block? Is it to just have students comprehend and think about comprehension? Is it for kids to be learning how to synthesize code and meaning? Because quite frankly, I think a lot of the data right now is showing that during that ELA block, kids are really struggling. The data is not showing that the kids are mastering things, right? These curriculums write these assessments, and kids are taking unit assessments in K1 and 2. A lot of the teachers are still reading out loud the assessments because the kids haven't broken the reading code, and the data is looking kind of ugly. So I'm just trying to like sort through it as their coach on what are the expectations in the early grades, especially when a lot of the kids can't read yet or are struggling to read. Are we trying to get them to read during that comprehension portion? Are we just getting them to understand, to listen and understand? Are we just discussing strategies? How do I put it all together?
Yeah, I guess that the emphasis shifts even within that 3-year period if we're talking K-2. So the company I work for, MultiLit, has a reading program called MultiLit, which is initial reading instruction, and it is a 90-minute program for reading and spelling. And the first 2 years is very much a code emphasis. So with the knowledge that most students, and again, we need to sort of look at English language learners a little bit differently, but for native English speakers, those children come to school with their oral language is superior to their understanding of written language. So they come to school knowing a lot of words, hopefully, and what we need to be able to do is to show them how to translate those black marks onto the page into the words in their vocabulary, and create a greater synergy between those two things. But instruction then needs to keep moving along side by side. So we can't just only focus on code, because then their oral language development will become stagnant, and we don't want that either. But there is that code emphasis, because that's the thing that they don't know generally. And also it's the thing that teachers are ideally trained to do. Whereas, parents, grandparents, carers aren't necessarily trained how to teach how to, do that code breaking, the reading part of things. Whereas, hopefully they're getting, still continuing to develop their oral language and doing shared reading and so on at home. So that would be, the general recommendation. You never just do phonics. Because a phonics program, the effectiveness of it will depend on how much, oral language children have as well, because we all know that, when a student can decode a word, if they don't know it, but they know what the word means, and they're not reading, and vice versa. So you know a lot of words, if you can't work out what the words on the page are, you're not reading. So that code emphasis at the beginning, gradually kind of shifting so that, when they're proficient decoders, automatic word readers, reading with some fluency, the emphasis then shifts and there's more time spent on vocabulary and reading comprehension. But again, just to reiterate, it's never just one and then just the other. It's just the amount of time that's devoted to them.
It's just hard, Jennifer, because a lot of these kids, in these knowledge building curriculums that I'm seeing, when they're given an assessment, they have to listen to the passages and so forth read out loud. Their attention spans, the passages are long, they lose focus sometimes, and the data is just showing like they seem to understand it in class when the mini lessons or the lessons are happening, and then all of a sudden they're all bombing these assessments. And then it's just strange, because like some of the stuff shows that those standards don't have to be met until second grade, but now we're asking them to take an assessment that's asking them to show mastery. So like
that is interesting. That is really, really interesting. And I see the same thing, that, there's a disconnect between what the program has in terms of the components in the program, but yet the standard would come much later in time. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, you really want to assess what you're teaching to find out if students have learned what you've taught. And that's really the mastery component, isn't it? And so teach, then assess and reteach if it hasn't been mastered. And, in a cumulative way. So not teach, then test, and then leave that bit behind, teach, then test, leave that bit behind, and hope that, in 2 years' time, they've remembered the stuff you haven't taught or tested for, 6 or 12 months. So that curriculum-based assessment, and the mastery assessment sort of is one sort of ongoing piece. But then there's also those underlying sort of the building up of skill at the same time. So progress monitoring on an assessment that isn't necessarily directly related to what you've just been taught. So an example of that is oral reading fluency, for example. So you might think about, a non-word reading test for determining whether children have learned to decode. So a non-word reading test is a really pure version or pure assessment of decoding ability, because that children can't have just remembered that word from something they've read before. So you might ask them, to read, instead of reading sit, you'd ask them to read sut, and see if they can actually read, just work out what the word is. So that might be one way of testing decoding. But then oral reading fluency as an over time measure that you can do, once a term or more often, to to see, you know, what's going on in terms of a generic kind of building of skills. So those are sort of the two ways to assess in those early grades. But if you're waiting until, like in Australia, our first systemic assessment is in year 3, that's you know, obviously schools are doing other sorts of assessments before that. It's no way that any student, that's the first time they've had their reading assessed at all. But you know, that's sort of the first time as a system we look at, you know, have children learn to read. And there really needs to be something quite much earlier than that. And so that's why I've been such a strong proponent of the phonics reading check or phonics screening check in year 1, because that will give you a really good, yes, it's assessing phonics only, but that's a foundational skill that, you know, if a child is struggling with that screening assessment, then they are going to struggle with reading. So it's not a guarantee. Just because they can decode doesn't mean that, you know, they're comprehending, but it is a prerequisite for being able to read with comprehension. And so attention has to be paid to that quite early in the piece. So it sounds to me as though there needs to be, you know, what you're talking about, Judy, an earlier assessment that's much more a sub-skill assessment that enables, you know, to sort of pull out what are the reading sub-skills that are developing or not developing. So
yeah, we definitely have Acadian screeners are very big in New York City right now, Dibbles, Acadians, and so forth. It's just hard because we're seeing some growth on those assessments, but we're not seeing as much growth on the comprehension based assessments for the little guys yet. And we want to make sure that, you know, we're seeing those outcomes. So, you know, it's hard when you're rolling out something. This is year 2 of rolling out evidence-based curriculum. And, you know, we've had some episodes. We had this guest, Maureen Ruby, and she reminded us that it's just a tool. We're still going to have to put a lot of brain power into like thinking about what's happening, why is it happening, and how do we, you know, make things better.
Yeah.
Comprehension is notoriously difficult to assess accurately. If you look at, and there have been studies that have been done on this, you know, comparing, say, 4 comprehension assessments, and there's just been relatively little overlap in terms of, you know, the variance that they're able to measure. So I think that's important to remember, that the judging comprehension skills based on one assessment is never a great idea. You need to use, for comprehension, it's a couple of assessments, and it's really, really difficult. The younger a student is, the less reliable a comprehension assessment will be.
That's a very key point. That's
I would agree with that, definitely. In your article, Jennifer, you have a quote here, and it was, "You can't be pro-cake and anti-ingredient." And I love that. And, you know, I think it's very interesting when we look at the big picture and, you know, yeah, we all want to get to the same place, but you can't ignore what got you there in the first place. And so explain that a little bit more to us. You can't be pro-cake and anti-ingredient.
Well, that quote comes from my friend Daisy Christodoulou. So she has written a lot about knowledge and skills, and, you know, the idea that you can do one and not the other. And the question is, you know, which comes first? To use an ingredient analogy, is it chicken or egg? So in order to be able to develop skills, you're relying on, you know, at least some knowledge. And then as you're developing your reading skills, you're gaining knowledge through reading, which then enable other skills. And so there really is definitely a reciprocal kind of relationship between those two things. But if we're talking about, you know, assessing reading comprehension as a construct and say, you know, this is the thing we're all for, you can't then just sort of say, well, I'm just going to ignore, you know, one part of the recipe because, or, you know, add a bit more of this because we know, you know, that's the thing we're interested in at the moment, or whether we feel as though the evidence is pointing. I think it's really, as with any kind of recipe, that you know, you need to have all of the ingredients there, otherwise it's going to fail, or it will, you know, produce a different result than the one that you're looking for. So what I really wanted to do with this article was to come back to the evidence and say, yes, we all have this great enthusiasm for knowledge building, and it's exciting, and kids love it, and teachers love to teach it, and no one's questioning any of that. But that doesn't mean we have to throw out, you know, the other parts of it as well that actually do have an evidence base, and it's wrong to say that they don't.
Leslie Laud, Judy mentioned Leslie Laud, and that's exactly what Dr. Laud said as well, that knowledge is important, but there is a ton of evidence for teaching comprehension strategies. Our friend Nate Joseph, he did a meta-analysis in this area. Also, it showed the same thing, that comprehension strategies are in fact important, and to ignore that, it would be really irresponsible. And I'm glad you said that, because in your article you said evidence is not uniformly strong. So I want to stress that, because people are definitely getting the wrong message, Jennifer. And I know that's why you wrote this article, but I would say that you know, you said evidence is not uniformly strong. It's promising for knowledge building, but yet everyone is buying a program now, at least it seems like it, that it's being pushed where everybody feels like they have to buy a knowledge-based curriculum for reading and writing. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think there's evidence to say that people shouldn't do that. I think that probably where we're headed at the moment over time is almost certainly that a knowledge building curriculum is going to be super effective. And especially, again, I just want to sort of draw that distinction between beginning readers and, you know, middle to upper primary. So just to be clear, I think there's much stronger evidence that that's useful at that level. What I'm most sort of concerned about is to make sure people don't abandon teaching comprehension strategies, especially for those younger students, and especially with, you know, oral reading, shared reading and questioning and so on, to, you know, to make sure that continues, and also not to abandon them entirely in the upper grades either. And when you look at those knowledge building curricula, so the one I'm most familiar with is Core Knowledge. They teach comprehension strategies, right? So it's done within that context, and so it's easier for teachers to use a developed program for a knowledge building curriculum, because it takes a long time to put something like that together. And so while I wouldn't say you must, it is easier, because it's really time consuming to put something like that together, as, you know, as an individual or as a school even. So certainly not cautioning anyone or recommending against that. I think it's a great idea, but just to sort of be a little bit a bit careful, particularly in Cater 2, that you're not losing that explicit strategy instruction, because it is evidence-based. And for struggling readers in the upper years of school, it's also evidence-based. High effect sizes for interventions. And again, to come back to an earlier point, not all year, you know, not all, every day doing some sort of inferencing task all year. Obviously, that's only going to have a minimal impact after a certain amount of time. So there's some professional judgment that still can be used there while we're waiting for the evidence around dosage. But at the same time, to reiterate that, you know, comprehension strategies instruction is evidence-based.
And you finished your article with a quote from Nell Duke. And we had Nell Duke on our last episode. And she had said, we can advocate for particular research-supported instructional practices without denigrating other research-supported instructional practices. And I think that's pretty much what you are saying here. That it's important to keep strategy instruction right where it should be. So Judy, did I leave anything out? Do you have any other questions or thoughts?
All right. So one question, Jennifer. So a lot of schools are asking for kids to complete something after a teacher would do a comprehension lesson. And then the kids have to go off and do independent work after a teacher modeled something. Some schools want to see artifacts, and some kids can't write. How do we memorialize that kids are understanding concepts in terms of comprehension?
Yeah, if
Say you
students
have
having-
25 kids in your class, you want to assess, you just did a lesson and you want to assess, did the kids understand what I just showed them to do? How can you produce something? Because asking them all to write a response or something of that sort might be very difficult for them. So how can you know if they've understood what you've just taught them?
Well, with a variety of children in the class with a variety of different abilities in terms of being able to demonstrate that knowledge, then one way is to have a sort of a scaffolded or a structured sort of assessment that leads children through that process of what it was that you were teaching them how to do. So there might be different levels of understanding that children can demonstrate. So one level might be, there might be some vocabulary words. Do you want to know if they understood, the vocabulary words in the passage you've been working with? Might be seeing if they can actually define or choose the correct definition of the vocabulary word. Then it sort of might be a sort of series of steps down towards, moving from, that sort of literal comprehension towards more inferential comprehension. And so a series of steps. And so you will be able to see from, where children get to in terms of the levels of.
But what about like for independent task without me? Like say they're at their desks and they have to do something independent. Yeah. What could they do? Like if a kid can't read, they're not going to be able to like read those vocabulary words.
Well, if they can't read, I guess it's a matter of, sitting with them and asking them.
Right.
There's not really any way of getting around that, I don't think, other than, the having an oral questioning. And that is going to tell you about their listening comprehension, but it's not going to tell you about their reading comprehension if they can't read the text. And those two things are strongly related, but not exactly the same.
Well, maybe what Judy is bringing out then is that this is the problem. There's a lack of understanding what the difference is and what you can reasonably assess and what you can assess. If the kid cannot decode, then how are you giving them an assessment on reading comprehension if their reading ability does not allow them to do what you're asking them to do? That doesn't really make very much sense.
No, and that's just, particularly the case when I talked about the unreliability of reading comprehension assessment for very young students, because if they can only read a limited amount independently, then there's only so much you can ask them in terms of their comprehension. So those two things are reading comprehension is dependent on reading ability.
I think Faith, it's that phone call that I gave you a couple of days ago with that wonderful worksheet I told you about. It was a worksheet where the teachers were asked to teach the students how to ask questions regarding the text. And then, this knowledge building curriculum had a worksheet that said, I can ask and develop questions. And, here are these kids and they have this worksheet about asking and developing questions. And maybe they could do it orally, but they certainly couldn't really write down a question to develop independently. So I was like thinking, why did the publisher create a worksheet for kids that are so young that had little boxes where they're supposed to be writing a million different questions? I'm like, should they just draw a picture? And then Faith was giving me some ideas. So it's very hard in the early grades. And I think the other thing that I'm thinking about is for the older grades, where would we find the best of the best strategies for comprehension work? I know that, you know, Hennessy came out with the blueprint on comprehension. I know there's many things that teachers did for a long time. I don't know if they're the most highly effective. I'm not a researcher where
I'm
kids
going to actually tell you, Judy.
where kids would
Jennifer-
underline. Wait,
Jennifer
what?
has a book, which I didn't mention. So
Why,
you want to
Faith?
see.
You waited till 8:30 to mention that? Why?
Well, why not? So her book is Effective Instruction in Reading and
Have one
Spelling.
here.
And so hold it up, Jennifer. There it is. I don't know if you could see
Get
the
it near the
title.
screen.
It's a little bit blurry. Maybe
Well, we'll put it in the show
me
notes,
see.
right?
Okay.
We'll
in
put a
show
link.
notes. And it is written and edited by Jennifer. There we go. And Kevin and Robin with Woodall. Is that how you say
Well,
it? Woodall. And so I would definitely say that she is an authority.
I bet there's no worksheets in there that ask kids to write a million questions when they still are learning their letters and sounds.
No, that would be fair to say. Yeah, those sorts of worksheets very much rely on children being able to read the instructions.
But why do we keep seeing them, Jennifer? If people are saying these programs are evidence and research based, why do I keep seeing these worksheets that literally make my stomach turn?
That is such a good question, Judy. Yeah, the program, everybody's saying, well, this is an evidence-based program. But wouldn't they find, if they tested out the programs, that the kids can't do those things? So why are they giving this?
There it is.
Yeah,
Ooh,
there it is. Please help us.
Yeah, and that's especially a problem in those younger grades. And if there are worksheets or independent work, you know, tasks for kids in year 3 and up, that kids are struggling with because they can't read, that's not necessarily the fault of the program. It's more the fault of their, perhaps their early reading instruction, that they're not able to read when they get into those upper grades, or they may have a learning difficulty, but it's not necessarily the fault of the program. But for, if something is aimed at younger readers who you wouldn't realistically expect them to be able to read independently, to be able to do a worksheet that depends on them being able to read independently, then there's some dots that are not being joined up properly there.
Yeah, but Jennifer, that is what Judy's saying. It is in the K1 and 2 grades that the program is asking these kids to formulate questions and put it in boxes. She showed me the worksheet and I just laughed. I said, this is ridiculous, and yet it is part of the program. So I don't know what to make of that. Jennifer, are there anything, any last words that you have that we didn't cover that you would like to add?
Yeah, not that I can think of. I just, I hope that people take from this discussion that, we're asking people to sort of think carefully about, what does the evidence show? Keep coming back to what that is, not to go beyond it, and not to throw out things, that, have been shown to be effective in the pursuit of, overcorrection towards something that, is I guess something that people are talking a lot about at the moment. So it's both, not either or.
Yeah. And, I think my last thoughts on this is, we need to really look at what was done before and say to ourselves, what worked? What didn't work? Let's be smart about this. And if it wasn't working, because I do think that people are confusing guided reading, comprehension questions that we would just throw out to kids in small group, lots of questions. That's not teaching comprehension. No. And that's not teaching comprehension strategies. And I want to be really clear that asking a bunch of questions in small group for guided reading is not what we're talking about here. And I think
good point, Faith.
So All right. Well, we want to thank you, Jennifer, for coming on with us. This was a great conversation. I think really so important. And it was really a pleasure. And there's a time difference. And we so appreciate you taking the time to work with us. Judy, why don't you let everybody know where they can find us?
All right, so here we are. Follow me on Twitter at BoxnerJudy. Follow Faith on Twitter at High Five Literacy at Faith Borkowski. Follow us on our newly designed Instagram page, The Literacy View. Also follow us on Facebook, The Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. Follow us on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel, The Literacy View. Follow us on all those podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Spotify. We're everywhere. The Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. And we're having a good time here. And just remember, we always said that the science of reading is not just phonics. Comprehension is very, very important. And I can't wait to dive more and more into this topic. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us here tonight.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And all your information will be in the show notes, your bio, your book, and anything else that's pertinent to the discussion. Thank you so much. All right,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Good night.